Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I hope this finds you well. This week we are starting a new book of the Torah. We are starting Vayikra, or Leviticus. As you may know, the names of the books of the Torah in Hebrew are taken from the first significant word of that book. But in English, it's more descriptive of the book as a whole. So it's called Leviticus, meaning having to do with the Levites, because we do talk a lot about the Levites, the section of the children of Israel that serve as the Kohanim and also serve in the temple. There's two different groups of the Levites, and we'll talk about that plenty during this book of the Torah. And immediately, something that people often talk about in relation to this parsha is the way that the word Vayikra is written in the Torah. So I'm going to share my screen. If we can see, the first three words of the book of Vayikra are Vayikra el Moshe, and God called to Moshe. This word Vayikra, it looks a little funny, doesn't it? There's a little tiny aleph instead of a regular aleph. If we ignore the aleph and just look at these letters before the aleph, it says Vayikar. Vayikar does mean to call upon, but it really more means like to call upon by chance. It's the same word that God uses when summoning Bilam later in the book of Numbers, who we learn about is not a good person. So we learned that according to our sages, God told Moshe that he shouldn't write Vayikar, he should write Vayikra. Vayikra implies something more intimate, summoning to an audience, something a little more loving, and Moshe was embarrassed to write Vayikra. And God said, no, I really want you to write Vayikra, not Vayikar. And so Moshe was like, okay, fine, I'll do it, but I'm going to do it small so that nobody thinks that I'm too full of myself. I think this is an interesting story. Who's to say whether or not what the root of this is? But I feel like, first of all, it's a nice example of moderation, that Moshe is like, well, I don't want to seem like I'm too haughty, but I also don't want to seem like I'm too modest and not actually recognize my goodness. That's something that's kind of a theme with Moshe throughout his life, that he's always considered the most humble person in the whole world. And being humble doesn't necessarily mean that you don't think highly of yourself. You can recognize that you've been given gifts, but that you don't think that they make you better than anyone else. You recognize that they come from the true source. So this is the beginning of the book of Vayikra, and there's a lot of different explanations in addition to this one about the little tiny aleph. That little tiny aleph is the interpretation of the Baal HaTurim. There's another interpretation by Rav Kook, Rav Avraham Yitzchak Kook, who was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of the state of Israel, and he kind of takes a more Kabbalistic stance. He talks about how each person is filled with lots of Hebrew letters, Kabbalistically, in sort of a mystical way. Each person is filled with lots and lots of Hebrew letters, and each time that person does a mitzvah, one of the letters that corresponds to that mitzvah lights up inside of us. And so to Rav Kook, this is sort of a reference to these parts of us that light up when we do mitzvot. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs shares an opinion that perhaps the little aleph was an expression of unconditional love, that we approach God in smallness, but we have unconditional love for God, and that God has unconditional love for us. So there's a lot of nice things with this. So throughout the book of Vayikra, we have a lot of, it's not so much narrative. In the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus, it's a lot of narrative. We get a lot of stories. We meet all the most important people. And now for the rest of the Torah, it's literally just Moshe our own. Like that's the whole story. And so throughout this book of the Torah, people always complain like, oh, I don't want to get a Vayikra parsha for my bar bat mitzvah because you're just talking about sacrifices and the temple and all these things. Vayikra is known for being all about the sacrifices and the temple and the Kohanim. Why are these things relevant? We don't have the temple anymore, so we don't have sacrifices. Why do we still read about them? Some people say, oh, you still read about the korbanot, about the sacrifices, because when Moshiach comes, when the Messiah comes, we will have the third Beit HaMikdash, the third temple, and we will have sacrifices again. Another opinion is Rav Kook's, which he says that we'll be in a time of no sin, so why should we need to do any sacrifices? Why should we need to do korbanot? Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a nice way to look at it. A kind of a way of avoiding having to talk about what will we do. Will we still have sacrifices when Moshiach comes? I don't know. But just to talk a little bit about korbanot, it's hard for us to relate to. We don't do sacrifices anymore. We don't have the temple. The word korban comes from the word karov, lahit karev, to come close to. word kiruv, often said that that's Chabad outreach, is the Hebrew word for outreach, to bring someone closer. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe did not like using the word kiruv because it implied that there are some people who are further from God and some people who are closer to God. Who is to say who's far and closer to God? We have no idea, who can possess a lot of holiness and not live a life that's as typical as we may think. But yeah, so we have a lot of stuff coming up about the sacrifices and the Kohanim, the Levites, and we'll continue talking about them. So the theme of this week, I guess, is moderation, that you should be, this idea of carrying one message in one pocket that says, I was created by the creator of the universe, the world was created for me, and another pocket to have that I am made of but dust and ashes, to kind of walk with those two ideas in mind and have them always present so that we can really find balance in our own lives. So Shabbat Shalom, have a nice weekend, and God willing, I will speak to you all next week.